El profesor Amhed Mobarak se licenció en Matemáticas y Economía en Macalester College, Estados Unidos, y obtuvo su maestría y doctorado en Economía en la Universidad de Maryland, Estados Unidos. Amhed está investigando en Bangladesh, Nepal y Sierra Leone experimentos de campo. Él explora maneras de inducir a las personas en países en vías de desarrollo a adoptar tecnologías y conductas que mejoren su bienestar. También examina las complejidades de escalar dichas intervenciones que resulten efectivas en sus experimentos. Sus resultados han sido publicados en journals de diversas disciplinas, como Econométrica, Science, American Economic Review, Review of Economic Studies, The American Political Science Review, Nature, Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, and Demography. Y han recibido cobertura periodística del New York Times, The Economist, NPR, BBC, NBC, The Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Science, Nature, The Times de Londres y otros medios de comunicación de todo el mundo. Ha dictado clases en Australia, el Reino Unido, Suiza y ha sido consejero para Naciones Unidas, la Organización Mundial de la Salud, el Programa Mundial de Alimentos, el Banco Mundial, etc. Fue reconocido con la Carnegie Fellowship en el año 2017. Ahora mismo, Amhed es profesor de Economía en la Universidad de Yale y es fundador de Y-Rise, la iniciativa de investigación e innovación y escalamiento de Yale. Hoy nos muestra los resultados de su investigación sobre la adaptación de los agentes económicos a los controles legales en la pesca. Mushfiq, now you can begin your presentation.
We recorded in our paper, even though we did not prompt it. And you see that in the information campaign areas, they are more likely to mention the ban. Enforcement areas more likely. And places where we run both information campaign and the enforcement visits is also the case. Okay, so this teaches us that the consumers at least paid attention to the information campaign. Second, we are going to move to the mystery shopper data, right? Whether or not hake is available. So if you just look at fresh visible hake, the type of hake I showed you in the picture that is being displayed in front, right, with the price. With fresh visible hake, you do see that compared to the control group where these treatments are not happening, there is a significant reduction in fresh visible hake sales. In the information campaign area, a larger reduction in the enforcement area, right? And similar reduction in when it's both information campaign and enforcement, right? So both together is not producing additional effects, but it seems like enforcement campaign is producing slightly larger effects than information campaign. However, remember this is fresh visible hake, right? They could still be selling hake in the back like it's hidden, and they only take it out if the consumer asks for it, right? So when we include that, any kind of hake sales, this is what happens. The information campaign doesn't change, right? But you see the effects of these become smaller, right? And so what's going on is in the information campaign, there's no like this other idea of hidden or frozen hake, etc., like putting it on ice. But in the other areas, they seem to be practicing it. That makes the intervention less effective. Okay. So next, what we will do is look at, okay, so since overall we're not seeing this effect, right? From now on, we will just focus on this, inclusive of hidden, frozen, etc. But we will look at whether or not if you introduce unpredictable enforcement, if you introduce high frequency enforcement, does that lead to better performance of the campaign? And here's what happens when I'm taking enforcement and I'm splitting it up into predictable and unpredictable schedule, okay? And what you see is, again, the information campaign as before, a 13 percentage point reduction in hake sales. When it's on a predictable schedule, how the government would normally do it, there's no effect, okay? That's where, those are the places where the vendors seem to learn and they stopped. They learn and they just adapt to like selling hidden hake or something like that, okay? But when it's in an unpredictable schedule, that's where I have a harder time learning, and we have a very large effect, okay, of 19 percentage points. And this is inclusive of hiding and freezing. Still, it's a 19 percentage point change. So one lesson is that if you're going to do enforcement, this unpredictable schedule makes more sense, okay? And second lesson is that I was thinking that if you do it at high intensity, high frequency, maybe we can do better, because now with the high frequency visits, vendors cannot easily move hake from one market to another. But we get surprised, which is the high frequency enforcement does not produce much of an effect. And when we do it at low frequency, that's when we retain more of the effect. Yeah. So why would this be? It's because our interpretation is that with high frequency enforcement, there's more opportunities for learning, and vendors learn more quickly that they can hide or put it on ice and claim it's freezing, claim it's frozen hay caught in August, and they will be left alone. Okay, and then some of the patterns in the data week by week, right, that is consistent with the theory. So for example, we are looking week by week what happens in the markets where we have a predictable schedule versus red one is unpredictable schedule. So you see that beyond the third visit, right, there's no more effectiveness, okay? And you see that the performance of the predictable and unpredictable treatment diverge over time. As you would expect from the theory, initially there's no difference because people have not, it's unpredictable in both cases because initially they still haven't learned. But as they learn over time, right, you see the predictable schedule is easier to learn. It becomes less effective than the unpredictable one. Okay, so that is consistent with this model of learning and adaptation. Second, if you look at the low versus high intensity, you again see the same thing, which is in the high intensity treatment, it becomes relatively less effective over time. In the low intensity, it remains more effective. Okay, and again, this is indicative of learning that in the high intensity treatment, I have more information, I have more interactions with the regulator, with the government, and so I get to learn more. Okay? And so with the mystery shoppers, thankfully we get to observe these other things, that like are they hiding or freezing? So then we can directly look at the defensive actions that they take. You know, what is the nature of the learning? Okay, and we see that indeed Cernapisco officials were more lenient when people in the markets where they were selling frozen hay, because we can go and look at their administrative data to see where fines were imposed. And in these cases, they tend to impose fines less often. Okay? Here's what you see, that basically in the information campaign, there is zero. So red is, selling hidden hay. Blue is selling this frozen hay, meaning putting it on ice and claiming it's frozen. And by the way, it's not actually frozen. And the reason we know this is because they tell our mystery shoppers, oh yeah, we're just calling it frozen, but you need to pay me the fresh price because this is fresh fish. Yeah. So what you see is when you run the information campaign, they don't do any of this when you run the demand side. Okay, but only in the enforcement areas, right? You see that freezing and hiding becomes prominent. And the other thing that we see is that the control group, we divide up into two different groups. So one is control areas where that's not receiving any treatment, but where there is enforcement happening nearby within another area within 10 kilometers. So you're more likely to have heard about it, right? And you see, even there, they start hiding and freezing, whereas in the pure control, meaning these are control markets that are far away from any enforcement activity, you don't see any hiding and freezing there. Okay? So it does seem like a very conscious response to our, in terms of learning, a conscious response that they learned from our enforcement activities. Okay, and then you see that this learning happens over time. So over time, the proportion of hay that's sold, right, all the hay that's sold, the proportion that's sold in this hidden or frozen form increases over time, right? So by the end of the month, in the fourth week, like 75% of all hay sold is always being sold in this form, right? So basically, if you're going to sell, that's what they learned that you have to do. Okay, so finally, I will just wrap up now. So we looked at spillovers, and you do see that vendors, there are spillovers by vendors. So basically, we go and do the vendor survey, and we ask vendors if they know another vendor who sells in another area, and then we know that in that other area whether there was enforcement. And we see that even if you're in a control market, but you know somebody, another vendor who is in a treated market, then the control market vendor who is connected to the treated market, they also reduce their sales, right? We also see that there's an effect on fishermen that travels upstream, right? So fishermen who are selling to treated vendors from those caletas rather than other fishermen who are selling to control vendors, they report a larger reduction in profits that year, and so they see that demand shock. So that hopefully affects their behavior as well, right? Because fishermen, instead of buying hake, either they stay home or they can go fish some other, instead of fishing for hake, they can go fish for pomfret or something else, okay? And then you also see that in treated markets, some of the stalls disappear. Like during that month, some people decide, okay, it's not worth for me to try and sell fish anymore. So they just stop doing it. Okay? So finally, what about the cost effectiveness for policy, right? So based on our activity, we see like per dollar spent, which one was more cost effective. And you see that information campaigns ended up costing us, say, $5 per hake reduction, whereas the enforcement campaign, right, like overall was not so effective because part of it was, it was effective, but less cost effective, because part of it is that, when you do it at high frequency, right, high intensity, that's very expensive and it doesn't work, right? So then when I only focus on the low intensity enforcement, it's actually $4. It's even better than the information campaign. Okay, but that's great. The enforcement campaign designed well works well, but the government decided after our research, when we presented the results to them, that look, with the information campaign, we're getting a lot of the effect of the enforcement. This enforcement seems really complicated, because they asked, and he said, yeah, of course, this time with unpredictable, with low intensity, we figured out how to address this problem. But maybe next year they will come up with another clever method to get around the enforcement, right? We can't predict that. So once we had the discussion with government, they decided, okay, it makes sense for us to just scale up this information campaign because it's working and it's less complex, right? And also, the other benefit is that when they ran the information campaign, they already had all the letters, flyers, etc., prepared. So next year, it's just easy for them to do it again because they already have the materials, right? So it would be even cheaper next year. Okay, so in conclusion, what we learned from this project is that, when we design a new campaign, could be maybe an anti-corruption campaign, we cannot just declare victory, right? As soon as we design the campaign and we see some effect, because in the long run, people learn, they adapt, right? And so short-term evaluation may be incomplete or misleading. We really need to think through how people will adapt, okay? And then we also learned that enforcement design matters, that unpredictable, low-frequency enforcement is more effective, right? And also the data collection strategy matters, right? That the administrative data from Serena Pesca would have been not sufficient for us to actually see all these reactions, right? All this leakage that happens through hidden hake sales or frozen hake sales, right? So we need to also be clever with data collection. In our case, we did it with mystery shoppers. And perhaps, that says that, okay, maybe mystery shoppers, if they're getting more information, maybe the government should actually think about that as a strategy, that you could incentivize consumers to be whistleblowers when somebody's doing some illegal activity. Okay? So if you have any questions, or, if there is work in Ecuador, I would be very very in touch. I'd be very happy to think about projects and collaborate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mobarak, for this enlightening presentation and very comprehensive. I know the challenge of presenting wide approach research in few minutes is really challenging, and you manage it quite well. So we have a good view of the project, we have a good view of the results, and most importantly, how it transcended into new government policies, evidence on the research. And I will wait to see if anybody in the room have questions, but in the meanwhile, I would like to start with some few questions I have myself here. Okay, and one of my questions while I was checking your paper and your presentation is, are there any information available on the fishing communities in the ways of they make other income for their families besides fishing activity? And have you controlled your database on that?
Yes. Thank you. That's an excellent question. Yes, in the paper, we do talk about this a little bit, which is we do a separate survey of the fishermen who are supplying to all these markets, right? To see how it affects them, right? Now, as I mentioned in the presentation, how it affects them is that when you run that campaign, then it does reduce the demand for hake, and the fishermen do experience that, right? But they are actually able to adjust, right? So if you want to continue in fishing, like basically you can fish for different fish. So it just requires you to maybe go out to a different part of the ocean, or you use and you put your net down at a different depth, right, to catch different fish. So there are ways of adjusting if they want to, right? Now, but of course, the purpose of this whole project, right, is that in the short run, this of course is an annoyance for the fishermen, because we are interfering with their livelihood. But this whole project, the goal is to protect their livelihoods in the long run, right? Because from the government sort of scientific data, we see that the population of this fish is about to collapse. And once it collapses, then it's bad for everybody. So we have to think through the future for these fishermen as well as their children and their,
Thank you for that response. And going along with what you have just said, and I am recalling, I am an aquaculture engineer. That was my first degree, so I'm used to the fishing techniques you explained. And in the government campaign that they have, do they include any information that brings awareness on the benefits of these fishing bans regulations? And if that happens, have you got any information on their response?
On the government side?
Because in the campaign there, that looks to be like the most effective way to reduce the fishing during the fishing bans and seasons.
Yes, so I think, so the government was, very happy to replicate the information campaign, right? I think the part, what I learned in my interactions with the government is that, regulation is complex, and enforcing regulation is very complex. When you go down to the field level, right, they have to have a set of monitors who will go levy these penalties. They have to have trucks, vehicles available for you to go to all these different markets, right, and maintain a regular schedule. And that's all expensive, right, for the government. And of course, when they go to the markets, right, and they levy a fine, that's very unpleasant, because these are ultimately poor people, right? And giving them such a large fine is, so that's why I think the government agents, when they see somebody saying, oh, I caught it in August, right? They're like, okay, fine, you can, because the fine is so steep, because they know that, look, if it really is, there's a small chance that they caught it in August, it would be very unfair, because I would be levying such a steep penalty. So, I think because of that, in environments, where, especially in middle-income countries or low-income countries, we often try to think about indirect strategies, okay? So instead of fighting with people, can we encourage them and give them, in English, the phrase is giving them a carrot instead of a stick, right? Can we encourage them through positive behaviors and positive encouragement to do the right thing? Yeah, that is good for society.
Yeah, thank you. And in the same vein, now that you mentioned the budget for this project, this is a more administrative question, because you were saying that it would be possible to replicate the study in other Latin American countries that depend on fishing activities. In average, how much a project like that could cost?
Yeah, this, so the expensive part of the project, if anything, is the government's activity, right? So the way to think about these projects, I like this question, because I think generally it's interesting maybe for the audience to think about how does one conduct these randomized control trials. So I'll use your question as an opportunity to kind of describe the process of conducting projects like this. Okay. So basically, the way to think about these projects is that there's two parallel set of activities happening. Okay. One set of activities I will call intervention, right? The other set of activities I will call research and data collection. Okay. So often the way the project works is that if there is a program that the government wants to run, right, the intervention, right? So there's already inside the government processes, they already have the people, right? In my case, it was monitors, San Francisco monitors, but it could be some other program. It could be a different environmental program. It could be a taxation program, right? So you have that intervention portion that the government normally covers. And then research and data collection, we usually come in with, with our own enumerators to in parallel collect some data, right? And a project like this, when you do, it's much less expensive than the typical project when you do household surveys. So if you have to hire a survey firm and you go to every household and you spend 1 hour, like randomly selecting households and conducting surveys, that can be expensive. But over here, it was much easier because all we had to do was hire about 30, 40 people to just visit the markets, like for an hour, like in the morning, visit this market, then go to this other market, visit for an hour and write down what you saw. It's not a long interview, right? So these can be much more cost-effective way of doing research, right? And so how the funding worked out, the Chilean government actually made a small contribution, but then we had outside, I wrote grant applications and had outside funders, including the University at Yale, who provided some support for the data collection. Okay, and I mentioned another example in Ecuador. A friend of mine has done this kind of work with the tax authority. Okay, so you'll see in the paper, we cite this paper about Ecuador taxation, where we see similar types of behavior in taxation, which is in the VAT system, right? So the government of Ecuador is taxing people like, based on what they report as their revenues and their cost, right? And so the government, digitized all this information about revenues, right? And wrote a letter to the firm saying that, oh, you reported your revenues to be X, right? It's actually, we have all the receipts and it's actually 2X. So you owe more taxes, right? So then the firm received the letter, and what do? They say, yes, you're right. Sorry, it was 2X, not X. However, our costs, which you don't know about, we had reported it to be Y, but it was actually 2Y. So therefore, even though the revenues are higher, the costs were also higher. So my tax bill is actually the same. Okay. So there was a similar, so that was a project, and similar in the sense that the intervention side was the researchers collaborating with the government to prepare these letters and send them out, right? And again, the data collection did not have to be that expensive because it was just administrative data rather than surveys, right?
Interesting. And now that you mentioned Ecuador, and I think I know who you are talking about in that paper because it was a very outstanding paper. What would happen if the punishment for those or the enforcement is different depending on the country? For example, in Chile, you mentioned it's through a fine. In Ecuador, you go to prison for breaking the fishing bans. And how do you think it will affect the results, if in any way?
Right. So it can, making the penalty much more strong like that can go in either direction, right? So one is, of course, if you make the penalty more serious, people take it more seriously, right? The more obvious direct effect, right? So maybe they do it less. But on the other hand, the story I was telling with the interaction between the person who is about to be fined or penalized and the person who has to do it, right? Those are two humans, right? And they have feelings and emotions, right? So if you are asking a monitor that go catch this person. If you catch this person, there's a very strong penalty, right? And then the person, let's say you catch them doing something and the person says, look, I just didn't know, I just forgot, okay? So when you make the penalty extremely stringent, right, then the regulator is probably going to be less likely to impose that strong penalty if there's a chance that, oh yeah, it was an honest mistake, right? So I think we have to think carefully about not levying penalties that are too strong, because then that will undermine the enforcement of it.
And that's a very interesting input. I have two questions from our attendees. The first question says, what happens when the exploitation comes from other countries? For example, there was a case in this past year where China was taking our tuna and turtles from the Galapagos Islands.
That's just horrible. I'm sorry, that's terrible.
That
Okay,
was
this is not
your ecologist part speaking.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm giving an unprofessional answer, but I am a diver, like scuba diver, and I really enjoy that activity. And that just sounds horrible. So yes, and China has been actually, okay, so yeah, so of course there is, if you are infringing on, so I will give a professional answer. Sorry, I'm back. So if you're infringing on Ecuador's territorial waters, right, then of course that is breaking international law if China is doing that. Yeah? But what they seem to be doing that's harder for us to deal with internationally is that there are open waters. That's not anybody's territorial waters, and China is sending ships all the way to the edge of Ecuador's territorial waters, right? But obviously turtles and tuna don't know where the border is, right? So they're moving back and forth. And so this, of course, has an effect on countries like Ecuador, Chile, right? And it has an effect on all of us, right? Everybody on Earth. I think we need to have new institutions, new laws designed in order to address this. And, the person asking, this is the type of thing that maybe I would be this is something I care about. I would be very happy to discuss more. So please email if you have more information, then maybe we can brainstorm some strategies, creative strategies on how to bring more attention to this issue such that it leads to some kind of action, and what kind of role can research play in that.
Yeah, and I agree with you that would be an interesting project, but it will also require like interdisciplinary team, like some people that knows a lot about international law and how to deal with those, because you don't want just to get the information and then get.
That's a fantastic point. And this is, this project that we are, well, I don't know, this is not a project. This idea that we are discussing, right?
Yeah.
Is the perfect example of the importance of interdisciplinarity, because you might need people who understand incentives, like social scientists, right? And you definitely need, as you pointed out, international law, and you definitely need people who are familiar with the local ecology and the environmental issues there, right? So,
yeah. I have one more question. Is how long did it take you and your team to make the entire research? And this question is from Gabriel Gonzalez. Thank you for the question.
Okay, hi Gabriel. So yes, so this was actually very quick, unusually quick, right? Not all research is that quick, and the reason is, I mentioned that the Hague ban is in September, right? So I remember that, I think it was in 2016 that the Chilean government approached us in the summer of 2016 that, oh, this is the problem we're working on. Would you be willing, would you be interested in helping evaluate and, right? So they participated in a little course that we ran, right? Like a course on evaluation techniques and why we do randomized control trials, how we do it in collaboration with governments. So they participated in the course in June, and then they were trying to find the researcher who can help. So suddenly in June, I hear about the project, and I was like, okay, if we are to do this project, then we need to actually implement it in September, right? So I remember I visited Chile in July that year, or maybe in early August, right? And that's when I visited the markets, immediately designed this, and we went in and implemented. So we had the first set of results available by December of that year, right? Now, but partly it was because we had to just move quickly, right? And it really helped that we already had office for JPAL, the German Poverty Action Lab, which I'm affiliated with, in the Católica University in Chile. So they were already, research assistants. So for example, Andres, who's my co-author, at that time he was working as a research assistant, and then later he came to get his PhD in the US. Right? So that allowed us to move quickly, because you have to have all these different little ingredients all ready to go, right? A research team, a data collection strategy, partnership, etc. But then, in terms of like, why are we still talking about this paper? Because that like what the process that slows down, it's not the production of the research, but then publishing the research in economics, right? That's the very, very slow process. But anyway, the government got to hear about the results right in 2017. So they were able to react to it within the same year.
Nice. So thank you, Professor Mobarak, and I'm sure we have representatives of various countries, Ecuador included, that would be happy to follow up with you, and maybe if you can write again your email in the chat so they can have access to it. And I have to tell, I have enjoyed moderating this presentation. Thank you for the information, and I think as every good research, it gives more food for thoughts and more material for further projects. Thank you, and thank you for those who participated with the questions.
Thank you very much, Mashfiq, for sharing with us the results of your research. Would you like to say something to the attendees?
No, so thank you, Fabricio, of course, for inviting me, as I said at the beginning. And Catherine, that was a very nice job of moderating, and we had a very productive discussion. Right? It was very constructive. And thank you, of course, everybody who paid attention and for the questions. And I see another question in Q&A. I can just type up the answer for it.
Okay, thank you, Mashfiq.